Don't worry, you can always count your personal injury lawyer to be on time. Thank you very much for coming this evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your attention, your engagement, but most importantly, thank you for your time. It's my immense privilege to speak to you this evening about what I do for a living. And we're going to take a little bit of a look as to the components of a personal injury claim. Now, it goes without saying, I hope none of you will ever have cause to meet me any other time than in this room, because if you do, something seriously bad has happened to you. Before I talk to you about what I do for a living, it's probably best that I introduce the firm to those of you who don't know. So, RTA Law LLP was started about 13 years ago by one solicitor, a secretary, and 2 dogs. The dogs didn't do much in terms of help other than shredding a few papers now and then. But it was started 13 years ago, and we've grown over the years, past 13 years, to become the market leader in terms of representing vulnerable road user groups in Scotland for personal injury claims. We do that through 2 main brands, Motorcycle Law Scotland and Cycle Law Scotland. Now, for tonight's purposes, we're obviously dealing with things concerned in the motorcycle industry. And over those past 13 years, our solicitors have grown to be 7 in number. And the unique thing about our firm is that we're all motorcyclists ourselves. So I'm a motorcyclist. I've done my Institute of Advanced Motorists training. All of our solicitors are motorcyclists, and all of them have done their advanced motorist training. And we feel that's really important because you cannot represent the interests of a motorcyclist unless you yourself understand things from their perspective. And it's not just a marketing ploy. We all genuinely are motorcyclists. Up there on the screen you can see a few of our staff, from the solicitors right down to people who work in our administrative team. We are members of this community. So you might wonder, well, why does a personal injury firm care about road safety? Because it's not in a personal injury firm's interest to care about road safety. The reason we care is because, as I say, we're members of this community. We take our obligation to this community very seriously. And we want to do more for road safety for this community, because we didn't feel there was enough being done. So that's why we're here tonight. What if that happens to you? What if you're in that situation? Well, from a personal injury standpoint, there are a few things which I would like to see happen. And as I say, this is not about lecturing you, it's not about telling you what you should or shouldn't do, but from a personal injury lawyer standpoint, these are a few things I'd like to see. Getting yourself to a safe place, it kind of goes without saying, but we've learned a lot tonight already in the single thing you've seen about what to do to get yourself safe. A lot of us ride with friends, so make sure your friends know to get you to a safe space. Call the emergency services. We've learned tonight how to do that properly and effectively and in a good way. Obtain photographs and witness details. Really important thing from the perspective of potentially making a claim later on down the line. And make no mistake, none of this is at the forefront of anybody's mind when the worst happens, but it's a good thing to equip yourself with. Retain dashcam footage if available, and also, most importantly, for my purposes, if you ever do make a claim, you need to obtain the registration numbers of any vehicles involved in the collision. Now, on your seat, there is a leaflet, and contained within that leaflet there is a fridge magnet. Now, that is really important that you have this in case the worst ever happens to you, because you or your family need to know who to call, and it's not necessarily your insurer. So the law in Scotland is unique. Sometimes we see articles talking about British law or UK law. Nonsense. Scotland has its own legal system. And we have done for a long period, even predating the Act of Union, and we've still got it. And we have a unique legal system. The footage you saw of the speeding motorcyclist colliding with the car, there are 2 parts of the legal system which come into contact when that collision occurs. There's the criminal law and the civil law. Now think of them as a tree. That's the legal system. On one branch we've got the criminal law, and on the other branch, entirely separately, we have the civil law. So for example, as a result of that particular collision circumstance, there might be an offence of speeding or dangerous or even careless driving. But that doesn't preclude that individual from making a civil claim for personal injury. The reason for that is they're entirely separate legal systems. One doesn't affect the other. And personal injury itself, as part of the civil claim system, there are two main strands that I tend to do all day in terms of my investigations. One is liability investigations, and the other is quantum investigations. Now that's just a fancy way of saying valuation. These are the two main things that I spend all day doing. And a lot of the claims that I deal with on a daily basis, and indeed most personal injury claims in Scotland, are dealt with under this particular statutory instrument. Now, if you're an insomniac, it's a great read at night. These are the rules which govern how personal injury claims are conducted. And they're quite strict rules. So a really common question I often get asked is, why does my claim take so long to resolve? The reason for that is twofold. Number one, claims can only move as quickly as you, the individual, take to recover. And number two, there are very strict processes in place as to how quickly claims can progress. Because compensation, you only get one chance at it. It's one bite of the cherry. So it's important that it's done properly and it's done right. And this particular protocol, it applies to most cases, even up to the value of £25,000. But most third-party insurers will agree to negotiate claims under the protocol, even if they exceed that value. So the strict time limits are, from the point of intimation of a claim, there's 21 days for that insurer to respond and note interest. There's then a 12-week period to investigate liability. Now that might not sound like a lot of time. An insurer, from their perspective, will do things like talk to their policyholder. There'll be investigations of the police, which we'll talk about a bit later. But that's all they have. It's 12 weeks, nothing more, nothing less. And after the end of the 12 weeks, they must commit to a liability position. They either admit liability or they'll deny liability. In the event of an admission, you then gather medical records, medical evidence, and then you value the claim, and then you can submit settlement proposals. And from there, there's a 5-week period for settlement to be negotiated. But that's not always possible, and liability is often denied for all sorts of reasons which we'll come on to. So the elements of a personal injury claim. Police Scotland. The police do a really difficult job. And when Inspector Johnson gets here, he's not going to tell you how difficult his job is because he's not really allowed to do that. But from my perspective, I see every day the immense strain that police service are under. And their job's really hard. Because they're first responders. They come to these accident scenes. And we'll learn a little bit more once Inspector Johnson comes and gives you his talk. But what they have to do is they attend a scene and they preserve life. They then investigate whether or not a crime's been committed. But also as a secondary function, they gather details of the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why of any collision. And that information can be obtained later on by someone like myself. And it gives us an insight into exactly how a collision might have occurred. So any collision that occurs where the police attend, they're required to create what's called an abstract report. Now this gives details of the parties involved, their insurance details, registration numbers, where the accident occurred, and, as we'll learn, collision factors. Now, it's not the police's role to determine who's at fault for an accident. They are only considering and they're only interested in an investigation of whether or not a crime has been committed. Fault is for people like myself to be interested in. Witnesses. How many of us, when we saw the video earlier, what colour do you think the Audi was? Some people say blue, some people say black. The cyclists that were in the video, were they riding one behind the other or two abreast? The Audi itself, does it come from a tarmac road or does it come from a dirt road? Well, with witness details, if you have 5 people witnessing the same accident, they'll all tell you 5 different stories. And that's completely normal. People see and experience things differently, especially when it comes to speed. But also, accidents, and by their very nature, are traumatic events to witness. So sometimes our brains don't necessarily process everything that we're seeing at once. So whilst witness information is really important, it's not necessarily always going to be the most accurate source of information. But in my liability investigations, it's always really important to leave no stone unturned and make sure you speak to everybody who might have seen an accident. Insurers, a really important element of personal injury claim. And this goes for both the third-party insurer, who are the insurance company of the potentially at-fault vehicle, but also your own insurer. Now, how many of us, when we got our motorcycle insurance, tick the box that says legal expense at the end of our policy? Hands up. That's at least 50% of this room, I think. Anybody want to say why they tick that box? Just in case. Yeah, of course. Just in case. Because human beings are naturally risk averse. You know, if we've got a way to mitigate against risk, we will probably do that. It's a sensible thing to do. And that option for you is put there deliberately at the end of however much money you've spent on your policy as a little add-on, a little £5 extra, a little £10 extra. Did any of you ever think about what expenses it's actually covering you for? Loss of limbs? No. There are no expenses that an insurance policy protects you against in terms of legal expenses. It's a scam. Seriously. And I'll tell you why it's a scam. I'm a personal injury solicitor. I represent people who pursue personal injury claims every day. I represent clients on a speculative basis. So that means I fund their cases. I don't charge them fees to bring their case. I work on a speculative basis. So the question has to be asked is, what are those expenses that you tick that box covering you for? There are no expenses. Your insurer won't be able to answer that question. If you ask them, they won't be able to answer that question. So the only thing that you ticking that box allowed your insurer to do was, in the event of an accident, when you call them up, they sell your information to what's called a panel solicitor. Now, a panel solicitor is somebody who has paid some money for your case. They've maybe paid £150, £250 for your information. And if anybody's ever been involved in a personal injury claim, you will know if this has happened to you. Because you'll be contacted by the panel solicitor, and it'll be a process-driven exercise. You'll be given forms to fill in, and your case will be conducted in a process-driven way. You will not have your case tailored to you. It's sausage factory kind of stuff. So please don't ever tick that box. Expert witnesses. When it comes to investigation of liability, sometimes lawyers need help from people like expert witnesses, because we don't really know anything about anything. We need help from people who are much more cleverer than us. And expert witnesses can be vitally important when it comes to liability investigations, because they give an insight into potentially how a collision occurred. Now, Police Scotland, in the event of a fatal collision or a collision that might prove to be fatal, they will send out specially trained police officers who are called collision investigators. And these specially trained officers are able to use physical evidence left in the roadway and other evidence to reconstruct a collision in real time. And they use 3D models to do this. An expert witness can do the same thing. So when you're testing the veracity of any police or other evidence, sometimes you need the services of an expert witness. Equally as well, if you're ever dealing with a road defect case, you might need the services of a civil engineer to help give an insight as to how long a defect has been there, how often it ought to have been inspected, or whether or not there should have been intervention beforehand. So expert witness is another really important strand to a personal injury claim. Moving on to quantum. Your medical records tell a story that you can never tell. From the point, if you are unlucky enough to be in this situation where you're picked up by an ambulance, you'll make your way through our wonderful NHS. And they're brilliant at an acute care stage. And your medical records will tell a story from the point the collision happened to the point you're discharged from their care as to exactly what happened to you. And they're really important when it comes to consideration of a personal injury claim because it gives a narrative. It tells a story of what happened to you. And that leads us on to the assistance of expert witnesses as far as quantum investigations are concerned. So I'm not a doctor. I can never determine the extent an injury has affected you. I can only talk to you about that, but I can't get an understanding on a medical level. So I instruct people like an orthopedic surgeon if you'd sustained a fracture, a neurologist if you've sustained a brain injury. These people all are part of a wider team, and we're able to build a case and pull all the strands together. It's the lawyer's job to pull all those strands together to understand the full extent an accident has had on somebody's life. Rehabilitation. In some cases, you might be offered rehabilitation by a third-party insurer to help you get better. Now, that is not done because they're feeling altruistic or they want to help you out of their own pocket. A third-party insurer wants to engage in rehabilitation because it benefits them. The obvious example is if we can get you rehabilitated to the extent that you'll return to your pre-accident employment, that's going to have a big effect on the potential value of your claim. But it's to your benefit because you get your life back. So that's potentially why rehabilitation is quite an important strand of a personal injury claim. Now, after all of this, we get to the stage of valuation. Now, how do lawyers value claims? Has anybody ever asked ChatGPT to value a personal injury claim for them? Some people have. If you give ChatGPT a scenario, it will give you an answer. Now, whether or not the answer is right is not necessarily something that I can give you advice on, because a computer model will only give you as good an answer as the information you put into it. But the way lawyers value a claim is we have to be quite clinical about human emotion, human lived experience. And the idea behind compensation is to compensate. Sometimes you see articles about people being awarded or rewarded for personal injury claims. There's no such thing. It's compensatory in nature. What we're seeking to do is we're trying to put people back into the position they were but for the accident. Now, I'm here to tell you this evening that that's never a possibility that can be delivered. Any client I've ever had over the years that I've been doing this job, if you asked them, would you rather the accident had never occurred than get compensation? The answer is obviously universal. It's always the same. Everybody would rather the accident had never happened. Because when a collision occurs, it's like throwing a stone into a still body of water. And when you throw that stone, all these ripples go everywhere. That's the effect that the accident has on your and your family and your friends' lives. It's almost immeasurable. So when it comes my job to try and measure that impact, it's quite a difficult thing to do. But we do have a few tools that we can try and utilize to help us do this. Now, as part of your personal injury claim, you'll be entitled to a number of what we call heads of claim. The most contentious is perhaps something we call solatium, which is just a fancy Latin word for pain and suffering. Solatium in Scotland is not as, shall we say, generous as it is in some other jurisdictions. This is not America. There's no such thing as punitive damages. As usual, we're quite stoic when it comes to personal injury awards. And lawyers use this book a lot of the time to help us when it comes to valuing solatium. And over time, there's been a lot of cases which have been heard by judges, people suffering injuries and being awarded compensation. And we can utilize that bank of cases. It's called the common law, judge-made law. But the problem with that is that nobody's going to suffer a personal injury claim in the same way. We're all unique, we're all different. Even people who've suffered the same injury might experience pain differently, and their recovery might be different. So it's a really difficult question when it comes to valuation and how a lawyer does that. But once you've gone through that whole process and you've brought all those strands together, you eventually get towards settlement. Now, settlement for a lot of people is light at the end of the tunnel. It's the end of a long road. And I hope that you might realize on the basis of this talk, there's an awful lot of those strands which go into actually getting towards that point for people. when you get towards settlement for clients, you'll either be able to negotiate a settlement with a third-party insurer, or the alternative is that you proceed to court. Litigation. Now, litigation is something which happens every day. For a third-party insurer, they want to avoid litigation at all costs because of the cost. As far as the personal injury claim is concerned, from the perspective of an insurer, you're a decimal point on a spreadsheet. But from the perspective of a personal injury lawyer, you're not that. You're not a decimal point. You're a person. And you deserve a tailored approach to your personal injury claim. Now, the reason we do this job is because ultimately we're also motorcyclists and we ride too. And the purpose of our firm is to guide you through the unknown. I hope, as I say, you'll never have reason to encounter me in my professional life. But if you ever do, I'd hope you'd pick up the phone. We'd be able to give you some advice. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Thomas. I've worked with Thomas for almost 10 years, and I didn't have a clue what he did all day, but there you are. Thomas can take a couple of questions. We do now have the police officer, Inspector Johnson, has arrived. But before that, Thomas can take a couple of questions if anyone's got any. Stick your hand up. Gentleman over in the front there, and then there's another gentleman in the centre. Left a bit, Ros.
Just a quick question about potholes causing injuries or damage to a push bike, motorbike, or falling off.
What's the question?
Can you claim against the authorities for having a pothole?
Got it. So the Road Scotland Act of 1984 sets the groundwork in terms of making a claim for a road defect. Now, that particular act has duties which are incumbent upon local authorities to keep the roads maintained. The problem with the act of legislation is it doesn't actually say to what extent. Now, it's generally thought, the cases that have come before courts, that they have to keep the roads maintained to a reasonable standard. The problem with that is it's a subjective standard. So, when it comes to making a claim as a result of a road defect, whilst it is possible, these are generally thought of as the most difficult cases to bring. Because you have to show that the local authority either knows or they ought to have known about the defect which caused your accident. Whilst not impossible to do, that's quite a difficult task at times. But certainly you can bring claims against local authorities, yes, and it's something we do for clients on a daily basis. Anyone else? Yes, gentleman at the front, a couple. Yep.
Some insurance policies have a clause in them that you have to use an accident management company when you've had a claim. Is that right? Do you have to use the accident management company?
I'm really glad you asked that question. So there's a really important distinction between telling your insurer about an accident and using them to make a claim. So you have an obligation in your insurance contracts to tell your motorcycle insurer in the event that you've been involved in a collision. But that's where your obligation ends. But your insurer won't tell you that. You literally only have a reporting obligation. From that point, it should be your decision what you do. And we would obviously like you to instruct an independent personal injury solicitor. You are not obligated to use an accident management company for anything at all. And the problem with accident management companies is they don't necessarily have your best interests at heart. If you've ever been through that process, I don't know whether you have, that's why you're asking that question. An accident management company, their job is to profit as a result of your loss. Because what they'll do is they'll provide you with a hire motorcycle, which you can't ride anyway. They'll take your bike away down to somewhere like Surrey. There's a really large accident management company that has a facility down there. They'll charge storage, they'll charge all sorts of things. And it goes against the fundamental strand which anybody who's ever made a personal injury claim has to do legally, and that's mitigate their loss. So you have to mitigate your losses. You can't just stack them up without knowing it. And the problem with accident management companies is they don't tell people this. So people trust their insurers. you shouldn't trust your insurer. If you take away anything from tonight, my talk tonight, do not trust your insurance company. Seriously. If you have a question or if you're ever involved in a collision, I would highly recommend you simply pick up the phone and speak to us before you speak to your insurance company. Now, we don't charge for that service. We offer free advice to anybody who telephones our office. And we're motorcyclists, as I say, just like you. We're here to help. So even in the event that we can't assist as far as making a personal injury claim is concerned, more than happy to provide advice. Anybody else? Yeah, one at the front, one more at the front. Great question. What do we charge? So, we charge a success fee. So, as I say, we represent people on a speculative basis. So when it comes to making a claim, the risk is ours. We pay for all of those reports, we pay for the case moving forward, we bring the case to court. It's our risk. But in return for doing that, we charge a success fee which capped at a maximum of 20% of your damages. Now, the reason we charge 20% is because ultimately our interests are to provide for you, the client, to the best of our ability. And our fee is directly related to what we're able to recover for you. A panel solicitor won't charge you a fee. Now, if you're being charged nothing for something, to me that indicates that it's pretty worthless. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So to answer your question, we charge a 20% success fee. In return for doing that, we take on the burden, we take on the risk. Right. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Thomas. The only thing I would add to that, I'm not a solicitor, but prior to working with motorcycle law, I did work for one of the big insurance companies, and I wouldn't have trusted me either. So that's good advice.